It was around 1903 that the writer Wilhelm Jensen published his novel Gradiva. Carl Jung ended up reading this novel and shared it with Sigmund Freud. As we learn in Volume 9, it was Jung, as we learn from Ernest Jones, who brought Jensen's book to Freud's notice, and Freud is reported to have written the present work especially to please Jung. Notably, Jung took a special interest in the work's dreams, and he thought that Freud would take special interest in them psychoanalytically speaking. Freud read and analyzed the novel, and he wrote Jensen's Gradiva as the first psychoanalytic study of a work of literature. According to the Freud Museum London, we learn, Freud used the book as an example of the return of the repressed, the compromise of neurotic symptoms in the psychoanalytic cure, which he had so recently developed and written about. The story is about this archaeologist named Norbert Hanold. Norbert goes to Rome and he sees this sculpture of this woman who is stepping along. And he becomes infatuated by it. He becomes mesmerized by it. He names the woman depicted in the sculpture Gradiva, which is Latin for she who steps along. When he gets back to Germany, which is where he's from, he has a replica made and he hangs it on his wall and he contemplates daily. He took a special interest in the way that she steps and in her gait. And as he is contemplating her, he starts to wonder if that gait is reproducible. He tries it out himself. He tries to see if he can step in a similar fashion, but he realizes he can't. And then he starts to recall memories and see if he can think of anyone that he knows, any other woman that he knows that might step in a similar fashion. This proves difficult for him, as the writer notes. Hitherto, the female sex had been to him no more than the concept of something made up of marble or bronze, and he had never paid the slightest attention to its contemporary representatives. So here we get our first hint that this is an archaeologist who is mostly interested in things, not people. He doesn't even remember women, and if he does, women are depicted as marble and bronze, or sculptures or statues, or things to be dug up or found out about, things to be studied but never to be spoken with or related to. So he finally decides to go down to the streets and see if he can find any women in the streets who step along in a similar fashion as his Gradiva. However, he did not come across anybody who stepped along in a similar fashion, and this was very frustrating for him. He went to his room, he went to sleep, and he had a dream that he was transported back into time around 79 AD, and he saw this woman, Gradiva, whose gait so unusually captivates him, and she was stepping along. She became subsumed in the ashes in the volcanic eruption of Vesuvius at that time. After waking up and still in a dreamy haze, he stumbles over to the window, and he looks down into the street, and he believes that he sees his Gradiva, and he runs down to try and catch her or catch a glimpse of her, but she vanishes. He doesn't see her anywhere. He goes back up to his apartment. Frustrated, he leans onto the windowsill and he hears the songbird of a canary. And he decides to himself that he feels trapped and he needs to get out of here. He needs a vacation. He's going to go to Europe. In fact, he's going to take a trip to Italy. Freud writes, "We had left our hero at the moment when he was apparently being led by the song of a canary to decide on a journey to Italy, the purpose of which was evidently not clear to him. We learn further that he had no fixed plan or goal for his journey. An inner restlessness and dissatisfaction drove him from Rome to Naples and from thence further still. He found himself among the swarm of honeymooners and was forced to notice the loving couples of Edwins and Angelinas, but was quite unable to understand their goings-on. He came to the conclusion that of all the follies of mankind, getting married takes first place as the greatest and most incomprehensible, and the senseless honeymoon trips to Italy are, in a way, the crowning touch of this idiocy. Having been disturbed in his sleep by the proximity of a loving couple in Rome, he hurriedly fled to Naples only to find other Edwins and Angelinas there. Having gathered from their conversations that the majority of these pairs of birds had no intention of nesting among the ruins of Pompeii, but were flying towards Capri, he determined to do what they did not, and only a few days after his departure found himself, contrary to his expectations and intentions, in Pompeii." So Freud points out here that dear old Norbert Hanold is being driven by forces and motivations outside of his awareness. Unconscious motivations, if you will. Things really start to heat up when, while in Pompeii, Norbert sees this Gradiva of his, calmly and buoyantly stepping along the lava stepping stones of this ancient city. He follows her, loses her, and then finds her again. She's sitting along the low steps. He greets her in Latin, only to be answered with, "If you wish to speak to me, you must do so in German." And then when he addresses her as if she was the woman of his dream, she looks at him without comprehension, gets up, and walks away. Norbert calls after her, "Are you coming again here tomorrow during the noon hour?" But she doesn't turn around, she doesn't give an answer, and a few moments later she disappears around the corner. Hanold runs in her direction, runs after her, and when he goes around the corner, he doesn't see her anywhere. What follows in the novel is Hanold's quest to determine if this is a delusion or a reality. Shortly after, Hanold begins to wake up to his motivations. He becomes a little more conscious. Eventually, he could not but realize that his dissatisfaction was not caused only by his surroundings, but that its source was in part derived from within himself. He felt that he was discontented because he lacked something, though it was not clear to him what. And he finally realizes that he was being led here to Pompeii all along to see if he could find any traces of his Gradiva. During this quest, he meets this mysterious woman, whether a delusion, a hallucination, or a real woman, several times, and slowly his views on himself and other people in the world begin to change. As he is reflecting upon this couple who earlier he thought were brother and sister, he begins to realize their behavior now did not seem to fit a brother and sister. Their embrace and their kiss seemed to him to last too long. So after all, they were a pair of lovers, presumably a young honeymoon couple, yet another Edwin and Angelina. Curiously enough, however, this time the sight of them caused him only satisfaction, and with a sense of awe, as though he had interrupted some secret act of devotion, he withdrew unobserved. An attitude of respectfulness, which he had long been without, had returned to him. So we see that perhaps due to his meetings with this Gradiva and chance encounters with her and speaking with her, that his whole inward processes are starting to change, and it's causing an effect on how he views the world and how he views these other lovers that he's coming in contact with. Upon a chance happening while meeting with his Gradiva, he learns that her real name is Zoe Bertgang. So as it turns out, this Gradiva, or Zoe, is a childhood friend of Hanold's that it turns out he had really strong feelings for in childhood, and she just happens to be in Pompeii at this time. And an added twister, he realizes that Bertgang means the same as Gradiva. It means who steps along brilliantly. Freud points out that Hanold's delusion about this Gradiva figure is the consequence of severe sexual repression. He writes, "With the young man, things had taken a different turn. Archaeology took hold of him and left him with an interest only in women of marble and bronze. His childhood friendship, instead of being strengthened into a passion, was dissolved, and his memories of it passed into such profound forgetfulness that he did not recognize or notice his early playmate when he met her in society. It is true that when we look further, we may doubt whether forgetfulness is the correct psychological description of the fate of these memories in our young archaeologist. There is a kind of forgetting which is distinguished by the difficulty with which the memory is awakened even by a powerful external summons, as though some internal resistance were struggling against its revival. A forgetting of this kind has been given the name of repression in psychopathology, and the case which our author has put before us seems to be an example of this repression." And in another section, "If Norbert Hanold were someone in real life who had in this way banished love in his childhood friendship with the help of archaeology, it would have been logical and according to rule that what revived in him the forgotten memory of the girl he had loved in his childhood should be precisely an antique sculpture. It would have been his well-deserved fate to fall in love with the marble portrait of Gradiva." And on page 35 he writes, "It is precisely what was chosen as the instrument of repression that becomes the vehicle for the return." And on page 42, "Flight is precisely an instrument that delivers one over to what one is fleeing from." This quote reminds me of the story, The Appointment at Samarra. There was a merchant in Baghdad who sent his servant to market to buy provisions, and in a little while the servant came back, white and trembling, and said, Master, just now when I was in the marketplace, I was jostled by a woman in the crowd, and when I turned, I saw it was Death that jostled me. She looked at me and made a threatening gesture. Now, lend me your horse, and I will ride away from this city and avoid my fate. I will go to Samara, and there Death will not find me. The merchant lent him his horse, and the servant mounted it, and he dug his spurs in its flanks, and as fast as the horse could gallop, he went. Then the merchant went down to the marketplace, and he saw me standing in the crowd, and he came to me and said, Why did you make a threatening gesture to my servant when you saw him this morning? That was not a threatening gesture, I said. It was only a start of surprise. I was astonished to see him here in Baghdad, for I had an appointment with him tonight in Samara. The idea in this story being that you can't escape fate and destiny, and it is precisely the flight from fate, the ride into Samara, that led this merchant over to his death in Samara. It reminds me of those who might suffer from an anxiety disorder. Let's say that there's a certain situation that causes anxiety in this individual, and what they do to get away from this anxiety is they flee from the situation. However, fleeing is precisely the instrument that delivers one over to what one is fleeing from. With things like phobias and anxiety, we know that one of the best treatments is exposure therapy. It's exposing yourself to that situation which brings about anxiety. Fleeing from the anxiety actually only rewards the anxiety, promotes the anxiety, and causes more anxiety. Back to the website Freud Museum London, Hanold had chosen archaeology as a retreat from love, but it was an archaeological object, the sculpture of Gradiva, that aroused his desire. Thus, his repressed sexuality used the very instrument of its repression to gain access to consciousness. The symptom of his disorder, the delusion that the sculpture was a real woman, was a compromise formed between the sexual drive and the repression. A dream gave access to this unconscious process. A forgotten childhood memory of playing with Zoe had turned into a fantasy of having once lived in Pompeii, and this created the delusion that a dead sculpture was alive. In regards to the cure brought around by the psychoanalytic treatment, at the end of Jensen's Gradiva, Hanold is cured by Zoe. Through her patient sympathy with his delusion, she reveals that Gradiva was a disguise for his childhood love for her. When he realizes she loves him too, his own repressed love for her is liberated. In his study of the book, Freud takes us through the stages of psychoanalytic cure. Some part of the patient's desire had combined with resistance to form a delusion. The treatment consisted in giving him back repressed memories to which he himself had no access, except with outside help. Disguised as Gradiva, Zoe was able to give Hanold back his lost memories. In the history of the psychoanalytical movement, Freud wrote, "This theory of repression is the cornerstone on which the whole structure of psychoanalysis rests. In psychoanalytic treatment, that repressed is brought to consciousness. The essence of this change is the awakening of lost feelings. Psychoanalytic treatment is an attempt at liberating repressed love, which has found a meager outlet in the compromise of symptoms." And this quote reminds me of Freud's famous quote to Carl Jung, "Psychoanalysis is a cure through love." The idea being that there's a transference that takes place between the analysand and the analyst, and you begin to see the analyst in whatever way brings about the possible resultant cure. So for Hanold, he saw Zoe as this Gradiva. For someone else, you might take on a father transference with your analyst, and you might see the analyst as your father, and that might allow you to work it out. For someone else, you might see the analyst as your mother or your friend. This transference to this analyst or to Zoe or Gradiva brings about these repressed memories and feelings, and it brings them into the present and allows you to work with them. And after working them out, perhaps you no longer see Zoe as Gradiva. Perhaps you no longer see your analyst as your father. Perhaps you've worked it out and now you are in reality. You're no longer reading problems and patterns into people you're seeing, but you're seeing them for who they really are in this present moment. And that's how the book ends. As Hanold and Zoe were leaving the city of Pompeii, Hanold paused and asked the girl to go ahead of him. She understood him, and pulling up her dress a little with her left hand, Zoe Burtgang, Gradiva, Rediviva, walked past, held in his eyes, which seemed to gaze as though in a dream. So with her quietly tripping gait, she stepped through the sunlight over the stepping stones to the other side of the street. With the triumph of love that was beautiful and precious, and the delusion found recognition as well. So even if you never read Jensen's Gradiva, if you pick up volume 9 of the Complete Psychological Works of Sigmund Freud, Freud lays out Gradiva. He goes through the summary. You get to read along as if you're kind of reading the novel. It was a lot of fun. When Norbert Hanold arrives to Pompeii and sees Gradiva, and you don't know if she's a delusion or hallucination or if she's a real person, I remember thinking, wait a second, is she a ghost? Is he really seeing her? Where is this author going to take this story? It was a lot of fun seeing the way that Freud analyzed the novel, and especially with this being the first psychoanalytic study of a work of literature, and knowing how Jung brought this novel to Freud, and Freud wrote this work to please Jung. It was just a lot of fun. And if you want to nerd out like me, I suggest reading through it. I hope some of these quotes and things that I've presented to you today are helpful and spark an interest. If you have any thoughts or comments, I really appreciate any time you guys comment. Again, thank you. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next video.